I'm going to try to finish up this section today. Didn't play yesterday. There we go. Now it's working. Let me turn the sound on. Alright, let's just get into it. Today is a play day, so we're going to try to be efficient because I'm trying to play at around 1 or 2 o'clock today, so only a few hours away.
Now let's discuss when someone raises, you call, and then you get 3-bet playing with a 22 to 35 big blind stack. Now sometimes when you get 3-bet, it's going to be small, sometimes it's going to be all in, and those are going to be slightly different scenarios, but you already know how to figure out if you're getting the correct pot odds to justify calling if your opponent does go all in, right? Because you just figure out the percentage of the time you need to be good, add a percentage or two to that to make sure you have a little bit of an edge, figure out what percent equity you need against your opponent's range, and then call with all hands that have that amount of equity. It really is that easy. When you're facing a smaller raise, though, sometimes it gets a little bit weird because you may be getting the correct implied odds to call, especially if your hand is decently strong. So, as always, whenever you're facing this small-ish 3-bet, you always want to ask, like, what ranges are at play? And in general, the 3-better is by far the most important range to consider because they are the player who most likely has a strong hand. And if they are 3-betting over a tight raiser, they probably have a way stronger range than if they're 3-betting against a loose raiser, right? There will be some scenarios where it goes like 2 big blinds, call, you call, and then someone 3-bets to something like 7 big blinds. It's not a good play, but that is what some people do. And then if it goes call, now you have to put in 5 big blinds into like a 30 big blind pot. So you're getting 6 to 1 implied odds immediately plus something like 4 or 5 or 6 to 1 additional implied odds. So in that scenario, you very easily could justify calling with the good suited connectors, the pairs, etc. That situation doesn't come up all that often, like I said before, because usually you're not going to see a 7-way pot when you're playing 25 big blinds deep. But it does happen every once in a while. Also, closing the action is valuable, but in this scenario, like you're just not going to be getting back 4-bet very often at all. Obviously, pot odds here are very important. As you're getting better pot odds, you get to continue with more hands. So let's take a look at a situation where we have a player raising to 400. Let's just presume they're going to be straightforward. We have Jack 10 of spades. This is a spot where I'm basically always going to call. Now the player on the button 3-bets to 1,600, so 1,200 more. So in this scenario, what implied odds are we getting? Well, clearly not very good. We have to put in 1,200 to win the what will this be? This will be a 4,000 pot, so let's call that 3.5 to 1 plus an additional 3 to 1 behind. So we're getting 6.5 to 1 total implied odds, which is nowhere near good enough with a suited connector. However, Jack 10 suited actually flops really well. So this is one of these hands that you can play basically on its own merit to some extent. That said, getting only 6.5 to 1, being out of position, this is a hand we probably just want to fold. If I had King Queen suited though, I would definitely call and see the flop. I think Queen Jack suited is right on the borderline here. If I had Ace 10 suited, I would play. If I had Ace 9 suited, I would fold. If I had Ace Queen offsuit, I probably would have just shoved over the initial raiser. But if I did have Ace Queen offsuit here, I would probably shove at this point because Ace Queen offsuit is usually just going to be a pretty strong hand.
The thing he's doing here, where he's going, I would, shove with this hand, or I would call with this hand, or I would fold this. Like if he says, with Ace 10, I would definitely continue. With Ace 9, I would definitely fold. What he's doing is he's basically charting in his head. So this is how you can use the charts and apply them, effectively in game, because what you're doing is you're finding the dividing line. You're saying, well, Ace 10 is obviously good enough. Is Ace 9 obviously good enough? Then you can go no. And then you can look at some hands and go, Queen Jack is obviously not good enough. King Queen is obviously good enough. You can find the little dividing line in that chart, the little numbers that are either, filled in or blacked out on call or raise or whatever. You can find it that way in your head. So if you ever don't know if your hand is good enough, go up or down 1. And you sit there and go, I don't know if Jack 10's good enough. Is Queen Jack good enough? No. Is King Queen good enough? Yeah. And then you go, okay, is Jack 9 good enough? No. So you just realize, okay, I'm way in the nose here. So this Jack 10 goes away. But then again, you could sit there with Ace 10 and go, is Ace 10 good enough? Well, Ace Jack is good enough, that's for sure. Is Ace 9 good enough? Hell no. So then you realize you're right on the line and you're like, yeah, in this scenario it's good, or no, it isn't, based on what you know of this player. If they're raising too wide, then yeah. If they're super tight, then no. So you can find those hands that make the difference. I broke my nail. If you're gonna see it, there it is. So I'm gonna try to fix that tonight.
And if I happen to have something like pocket 10s or 9s, I'd probably shove. With the small pairs at this point, I think you do just need to fold. Like maybe 9s and 8s you can justify calling, but I think 7s and lower you should probably fold. So at this point, I'm just going to be calling with a smattering of good hands that flop very, very well, and then going from there. So as Jack 10.
And it's an interesting thing because like 10s and jacks, obviously he's just jamming here, right? That's cool. But 9s and 8s, he's saying I would continue. What he means is he would call. Because what he's saying is that even though he's not getting the best implied odds, those are a situation where he's looking for a safe-ish flop and then just get all the money in. So like if you have pocket 9s here and the flop comes off like jack 4-3, you can just do a stop and go and just jam all the chips in, because how likely are you getting 3-bet by a jack? Now if it comes out with an ace on it, you can just fold and you can just check and fold to a c-bet, and you could still have a chance in the tournament. It's not a great one, but you're basically banking on the 2/3 of the time when a raiser won't improve his hand. Now, sometimes when you see that flop, you're going to run into a jack, yes. Sometimes when you see that flop, you're going to run into a pair of queens, yes, in the guy's hand, and you're just going to go broke. But you're trying to give yourself the best chance to get back in it. But there's not going to be, it's only going to be about 1/3 of the time you're going to see a flop with 2 overcards on it, to your 9s. So it's kind of a good play. I don't do it enough. I will say that I miss that spot, because typically getting back to me, I kind of go, well, I have 23 blinds. Is that enough to fold here and continue and do well? Like if the blinds are going up and the next blind level cuts me to 15 blinds, well, I probably just need to get it all in with the 9s, and hopefully this is a race. You know what I'm saying? And it also depends on what I know about this player. So those are all the little things that come into effect. But I do miss that spot when I should just call, see a safe flop, and then do a stop and go. Stop and goes aren't a big part of my game right now, just because you don't get a lot of folds at the levels I'm playing doing stop and goes. People kind of always think it's bullshit, so you need to have showdown value. But then again, that being said, when you're screwed on chips and you have a little showdown value, sometimes it's good enough to just get it in. And you'd be surprised how often that jack high flop comes out, you jam it in, and the guy calls with, ace queen plus or king queen, or even pocket, 8s and 7s. People will just be like, what is this? Like they'll fabricate something in their head where you have some kind of draw like, 8-7. And they're like, that's bullshit. He's pushing a draw on me. I'm going to call with my pair of 7s and I'm good. And you'll just like find out that you're just dominating the person so many times, and you wouldn't have gotten there without doing the stop and go. So it's an interesting thing that I don't do enough, and I really have to start paying attention to it.
Suited good enough? Not quite in this instance, and I think we need to fold. So, like I said, I don't think this scenario is going to be coming up all that often, because usually what's going to happen is most people in this spot are just going to shove all in, and if they do shove all in, then it just becomes a math problem, right? Let me just show you how to figure out that math problem, by the way. Let's presume our opponent did go all in this scenario. He shoves 5,000 chips. It gets back to me. I would have to put in, how much? 4,600 to win a pot that is going to be, how many chips? Well, the pot's going to be my opponent's 5,000 plus my 5,000 plus the initial raise, that's 54, plus the small blind, the big blind, and ante, that's 57. So 46 to win, 10,700. So that means we need to realize 43% equity to break even. We probably want more like 45% to justify calling. So then again, we just go back in to Equilab, plug in our opponent a range to jam it all in. Who knows what exactly it is. Let's just presume they're only shoving for simplicity here. Who knows what their range is. You're going to need to pay attention and figure that out. But if our opponent is shoving something like this, which may or may not be accurate, we would just go here to Tools, Hand Range Calculator, enter 45%. And this is going to spit out what we should call with. And that's it. If we have these hands, we call. If we don't, we fold. And that's going to give you a little bit of an edge. And as you see here, it's just the best hands. Notice, though, we probably don't actually have too many of these in our range, because we probably 3-bet these pre-flop, 3-bet these pre-flop, right? So we're really just left with something like this. Notice if you don't have aces and kings, now we're really just not calling all that often at all. So that could be a problem. So what you need to make sure you do, especially if you have a player yet to act who is somewhat inclined to shove, you want to make sure you protect your range by flat calling here with aces and kings some portion of the time, and that's going to go a long way to helping you out. Also, that's often just part of a good, fundamentally sound strategy. You'll find that it's usually fine to slow play the aces pre-flop. Kings, queens, ace, king, maybe not so much. But if you do see that coming ahead of time, if you do see the player on the button getting ready to shove all in, obviously you want to be flat calling in that scenario. I've had a few...
To be clear, that is when you are at 25-ish big blinds. Then you can slow play the aces in this scenario because you've seen a raise. You're going to call the button, the small blind, and the big blind are all left behind you that they will put in the raise because the goal is still to get all the money in. So you're trying to set up the back jam where somebody raises on the button, cutoff, or big blind, and then either this guy goes all in or he folds and you go all in or whatever. It's very hard for players to see it, even though they know it's a good move, because it's very hard to do. This is a huge weak spot of mine. I still have that semi-fish mentality of I don't want my aces to get cracked. I am very, very good at getting the money in pre-flop with aces. I'm very good at it. I've gotten to the point where now when I get aces, even with up to like 80 big blinds, I can usually find a way to get the majority of the money in pre-flop through different betting strategies and different moves. This is one that I have a huge blind spot on because it would be so easy to get the money in with 25 big blinds if I just didn't 3-bet. Because when this player opens and I 3-bet, now he's opening from an early position. Everybody folds back to him and he has to decide, is this it or not? You know what I'm saying? And I make it, 7 blinds here. He's got to have to decide. More times than not, you're going to see me jam here for the 25 big blinds when I see a raise because I'm trying to look as weak as possible. Very good move. But there are later stages of the tournament where I fuck this up, where like we're down to like 2 tables and I have 25 blinds and somebody raises and I'm one of the mid stacks with him and I just call and it's a perfect position for these guys to re-raise or jam or whatever, and I don't recognize that spot, or I recognize it but I just can't make myself do it. So I'm working on it. I have sticky notes written down with make sure you have this situation played out and, do this move. Hopefully you'll see it from me in the next, day or two, because I'm going to be playing a lot today and tomorrow. But man, this is a huge leak for me because it's such a powerful move and it's such great equity. And it's a situation where it's not going to be so easy to get the money in. And this goes for aces and kings.
Spots in tournaments. I remember one time in a $25,000 tournament. A loose player raise. I had ace king in the small blind. I was about to just 3-bet like normal, and I could see the player on my left getting his stack out, ready to re-raise. Actually, it looked like he was going to go all in. So I knew that was a scenario where I'm going to call, he's going to shove, I'm going to be able to call it off my ace king and stack him, or at least get it in good. So he shoved. Then the initial raiser decided to shove. At that point, I was still happy enough because ace king is great, and I knew the initial raiser was loose. I got it all in. I was against king jack and queen jack. And somehow the queen jack managed to win, so that was unlucky. But in that scenario, we printed a lot of equity. We got the money in very, very good, and that's all you can really ask for. So if you do see this situation about to happen, do not be afraid to slow play. I had another one in a Sunday Million tournament. It's a big online tournament that happens every week. This must have been many years ago. I remember it because I had aces. It went raise, call, and I had aces in the cutoff seat. And I knew the player in the small blind and the big blind loved shoving in this scenario. So I called. Small blind shoved. I was like, oh, yes, I got him. He had the ace-jack offsuit, and he beat me, too. Funny how you don't remember the times that all these work, but you definitely remember the times they fail, especially when they're in very, very high dollar value scenarios. But, look, in those scenarios, you have to be very, very happy that you get your money in good, right? When you are playing poker, do not worry about the results so much. Worry about, am I getting my money in good and extracting value and making profitable plays? And if you can see these situations happening ahead of time, you can adjust your strategy significantly. For example, if we're sitting here with Jack 10 suited and I can look and tell the guy on the button's about to shove, just fold. You don't have to call just because your hand's normally a call. Pay attention to what your opponents are doing and then adjust accordingly. It's obviously much more difficult to do online than it is live, but if you are playing live poker and you can tell they're about to jam it all in, clearly don't flat call here with any hands that just cannot call a shove. So pay attention, adjust accordingly, and you will make much better decisions than if you don't.
Plus, online we have HUDs. We can see the players' tendencies through their HUDs, their 3-bet percentage, their VPIP, their pre-flop raise percentages, their button squeezes. We can actually look at all that. So it is doable online to find out. Yes, in live play, people will give up the ghost. You'll literally. I remember there's been so many tournaments where just as recently as playing tournaments at the South Point, those little $60 dailies, a couple months ago, where I'd be sitting there and I don't look at my hand till it comes to me. That's just the way it is. I'm confident in my ability to disguise my reaction to my hand. So if everybody's looking at me when I look, that's fine. But at that time, I'm kind of staring in the middle of the table and using my peripheral vision to look at everybody, especially deeper in tournaments. Or I'm doing subterfuge where I'm talking or telling a story or joking or whatever. But I remember this one in particular where this player was to my left, and he was a super tight player. And it comes around to me, and before I looked at my cards, I saw him like his hand, when he looked at his cards, he's looking like this. His right hand went like, and like it's a reflex that some people have when they like something. It's like they're grabbing it. It's like he's going, ooh, that's mine. So I knew he had a great hand, and he was super tight. And for this guy to have that reaction, I'm like, fuck, I need aces here. And I looked down, and sure enough, I had aces. So I went ahead and this guy had raised, and I just called that one. And I had like 50 blinds. I had a lot, and I was chip leading the tournament. It goes back to this guy. He had like 30 blinds, and he looks at it, and he looks at me, and I looked over, and I was right next to him, and I was like, what? I literally just did that. And he shoved all in, and I swear to God, he goes, that's what? And I went, whoa. And everybody folded very quickly, and I go, well, this is what? And I shoved all in, and I just showed him the aces like that, and he went, fuck! And he just rolled ace-king suited, and I beat him, knocked him out of the tournament, and I ended up winning the tournament because it was such a huge chip lead. But if I had 3-bet, I guarantee this is a guy who would have folded the ace-king suited, for sure. He showed me a few times where he folded ace-king suited to a single raise. But so it was a really tough situation playing against him, and I was so glad I picked that up. So little live tells are a thing. I don't really rely on live tells much. That was one that was like a huge neon sign that jumped out at me. It's kind of not important in live poker for tells if you're playing GTO. Low jack, 25 big blinds raises. You call ace jack suited on the button. Small blind goes all in. Low jack folds. Without any information on any of these players, I'm going to say most of the time this is going to be a call. I really, because the small blind is truly incentivized to play wide and use their exploitative shove equity. So I'm calling here. Yeah. Great shape, small blind jamming range at this stack depth. It's just too wide. Like, they're going to jam king jack, king queen, king 10, queen 10. A lot of players are going to throw in jack 9 suited in any pair, obviously. And ace jack suited is just way too strong against that. So it's a snap call. Not a snap call if you don't know that shit, but once you know it, it's just, yeah. Low jack raises 2 big blinds. You have ace jack on the button. You call. Small blind goes all in. The low jack calls. Yeah, that's a fold because the low jack's in too early position. You got to remember, button, cutoff, hijack, low jack. That's middle early position right there. So especially if you're at like a 8-handed table, that's or more. That's whatever. So I think this is a fold because you're just going to be best case scenario here. Most of the time you're going to have 3 outs because your ace is going to be counterfeited. So yeah, it's a fold. And it just shows you the difference in how players react, how your range improves versus other people's range. All right, we're going to mark this as complete. Go on to the next section. That didn't take too long.
Now let's discuss the situation when you're facing a preflop raise and a 3-bet before the action gets to you when you're playing between 22 and 35 big blinds deep. We have already discussed how to figure out which hands you should call with if you're facing a all-in 3-bet because the process is the same. You figure out your pot odds. You usually add a few percentage to the amount of the time you need to win in order to make sure you have an edge. And then you call with roughly that range. Now, in this situation, you may want to be a little bit tighter because the initial raiser could call the initial 3-bet all-in and you're all-in whenever they have one of their best hands. So you're going to find that in general, when you're facing a raise and an all-in 3-bet, you're usually going to only want to call off with, at the loosest, something like ace, queen, and better, and pocket 10s or better. And if you're against tight ranges, it may be more like aces, kings, queens, and ace, king. And that's okay. When it goes raise all in before the action gets to you, you need to be very, very tight. You can use Equilab to show this to yourself. I've already shown you how to do the math a few times now, so get in there and make it happen. What about when you're facing a raise and a small 3-bet, though? So someone raises to 2 big blinds and someone else 3-bets to 6 big blinds or something like that. In this scenario, you do want to proceed very, very cautiously. You should have no flat calling range when you were even deeper stacked, right? And that's certainly going to be the case now. Also, you're going to get 4-bet often enough to kill whatever implied odds or pot odds you have, so you cannot profitably call with suited connectors or pairs or really.
Now, there are differences here when you're playing smaller stakes because players don't 4-bet enough. So they won't 4-bet enough because they don't realize that when you have 80 big blinds, you should be 4-betting hands like aces and kings. They won't do that. They also won't put the squeeze on enough versus an open 3-better. So there are situations in the micros where you can cold call a 3-bet, but 90% of the time you're just giving it up at less than, like you said, less than 75 big blinds. Honestly, I think it's closer to 80 big blinds because of the actual pot odds that you need with hands like 10-9 and 10-jack. But, pairs, you can call, things like that. But he's right. I mean, you just can't continue. If it gets raised in 3-bet and you have pocket 7s in the cutoff and it got raised in the low jack and, re-raised, in the cutoff and you're on the button, let's say, with pocket 7s, you probably just want to give this up, even if you have 80 blinds, you know what I'm saying? Because you're only going to hit that set, very, very rarely. You're going to get the 10-1, sure, if it just goes call and then you see a flop. But like you said, if you call and the guy 4-bets, the original initial raiser 4-bets, you're absolutely convinced that you're screwed. And then you're in a situation where if the 3-better just calls, now you're looking at your pot odds going, well, they're really great, blah, 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 blah. But you absolutely know you're behind. Even with a hand as strong as pocket 9s or 10s, you really can't do anything unless you hit a set. So that's a situation where, depending on the stage of the tournament, if you're going to rebuy, if there's a freeze out, whatever it is, you may have to consider it. But also, you might just want to give up the hands that are truly not good enough to 4-bet. And you might just want to fold them.
Really anything. Some people think that when it goes raise to 2 big blinds and then a call for 6 big blinds, that they can still call with hands like king queen suited or jack 10 suited or pocket 8s with the idea that they're going to fold if they get shoved on. But that's just not a good strategy because you are going to get shoved on sometimes and you're just going to kind of play poorly after the flop. Like when you have pocket 8s, if it comes with even one overcard, you're not happy, right? And with king queen, if you flop even top pair, if your opponents want to put in their money, you're also not loving it. So this is a spot where you should either be all in or folding. So what hands can you profitably get all in for 25 big blinds when it goes raise 3-bet before you? It's difficult to say, but again, make sure you pay attention to your opponent's ranges, and often their positions will dictate their ranges. So against a early position raise and a 3-bet from another early position player, you should really only be looking to 4-bet all in with hands like 10s or better and ace-king. Obviously, that could be a little bit tighter if you think initial raiser is very tight or if the initial 3-better is tight, right? Against later position raisers, you can usually get in with something like pocket 8s or better, and then ace-queen offsuit and better, and ace-jack suited and better. At the loosest, you'll find that you should not have a 4-bet bluffing range at this point. Like you should not be jamming king 4 suited or anything like that. You're just jamming with a straight linear range here of your absolute best hands that are going to be in reasonable shape when they get called.
I'm of the opinion that 4-bet bluffing pre-flop, especially at the micros, is done when you can still fold behind. So a player raises, there's a 3-bet, and then you 4-bet bluff on the button, for 20 blinds out of your 80 big blind stack. With a hand like ace-jack offsuit or something like that, or even king-jack suited or something. And if you get jammed on, obviously you're folding and you still have 60 big blinds. I'm not of the opinion that there are very many good 4-bet bluffing hands where you're putting in more than a third of your stack. I'm just not in that camp. When you play bigger tournaments and deeper tournaments and larger buy-ins, yes. But obviously it's not going down to 25 or 35 big blinds. I think honestly, I think my bottom range on it is like having like 50 blinds, because like a player makes it 2 big blinds, another guy makes it 6, and then you can make it 15. And then if it goes back around and the other players fold, that's great. But if one of them shoves, you can obviously fold and still have 35 big blinds and be in a fine spot in the tournament to continue. But I don't believe in the 4-bet bluff all-in pre-flop. It's just not going to be profitable enough. And Obviously, Jonathan Little agrees.
that also have good blockers. Like when you jam ace queen offsuit in this scenario, you're not necessarily thinking ace queen is going to be a huge favorite when you get called, but it's essentially acting as a bluff because it has two very, very good blockers. And it has plenty of equity when you do get called because you're going to be against jacks or tens a decent chunk of the time. But when it does go raise 3-bet before you, you really do want to be pretty tight. Let's now go through an exercise to show how the preflop exploitative shoving situation still applies. So, remember, in this scenario, when someone raises and someone calls, and then you shove all in, you actually take that scenario and just change the ranges a little bit and change the percentage of the time they're going to call you a little bit, because really, nothing's changed. You're trying to figure out how often you get called when, or how often both players fold in the pot you win when that happens. You want to figure out the percentage of the time the first player calls you and your equity in the pot when you do get called. And then you need to figure out the percentage of the time the second player calls you and then your equity in the pot when you get called. If you do this, you can again figure out if a shove is going to be profitable. So in this scenario, you're going to find that the initial raiser will rarely call. So if someone raises to 2 big blinds, someone 3-bets to 6, and you go all in, the initial raiser will very rarely call because they have to worry about the 3-bet. The initial raiser is really only going to call off with something like jacks or better and ace king. So that is important to know. This is actually the opposite of when you were facing a raise and a caller earlier, because there the caller would be very unlikely to call your all in. Realize that in some scenarios, you will actually have little to no fold equity here, because some players, when they 3-bet, they only have the nuts. You're going to find that many players, when they're playing 20 or 5 big blinds deep or so, if someone raises and they 3-bet to 5 big blinds or 6 big blinds, they have literally jacks or better and ace king. If that's the case, this part of the equation is 0, because the percent the opponents fold is 0% of the time. If they fold 0% of the time, clearly you can't bluff at all, because you need the back end of the equation to just straight up be profitable, which is actually very hard to do. So let's take a look at an example here. So let's say the cutoff raises to 2 big blinds and the button 3-bets to 5.5 big blinds. Okay, we're playing 25 big blinds deep here. Which of these hands are profitable to go all in with from the small blinds, or which hands are profitable to go all in with from the small blind? That's our question. So we need to assign our opponent's ranges. Again, you need to take time to figure this out on your own. I've already assigned these players' ranges. We have the cutoff raising with reasonable strategy. And we have the button 3-betting as well with a reasonable strategy, where they're 3-betting with the absolute best hands plus a few bluffs, right? So
now the interesting part is these bluffs in here, king 7 suited, queen 8 suited, ace 9 off, it's a little loose for the bluffs. I think the bluffs for the button in most scenarios here lie with good blockers. King queen, king jack, queen 10, jack 10, hands like that. Those are the 3-bet bluff hands that will definitely fold if they get jammed on, but can absolutely put pressure on from the button versus the cutoff. So if I had to pick 3 hands, those would be the 3 I would pick. It's still the same thing percentage-wise, so it really doesn't matter with what he's talking about here, but I think in real world, especially at the micros, it plays different like this. It plays that way all the way up to medium stakes, actually, I believe.
this seems pretty nice. This ignores the times when they both call, but they will both call some portion of the time. Obviously, they're way more likely to both call when the cutoff calls, because when the cutoff calls, the button's going to have a pretty good hand a decent chunk of the time, too, as you see 58% of the time. But we're going to ignore that for now. So now what we want to do, in order to figure out which hands are profitable to go all in with, we want to set our profit to 0 and then find the break-even all-in range. So here we have it. I've outlined the entire equation that we have here. So we need to go through, we set profit to 0, and now we just need to plug in all of these numbers that we can. Okay? So take a second, try to figure this out on your own. Pause the video if you need to. It should take you a little bit of time.
I'm not going to go through it, but I'm doing it in my head.
All right. So, in this scenario, what percentage of the time do they both fold? Again, this is not exact math, but the initial raiser is going to call our all-in 18.5% of the time, so that goes here. The 3-better is going to call it 58.3% of the time, which goes here. And the rest of the time, 23.2, goes here. Okay? How much do we win when they both fold? Well, we win the 2 big blind raise, we win the 3-bet, we win the small blind, the big blind, the ante. That goes to 10 big blinds. Okay, so that's what we win when they fold. Now we take our equity in the pot. This is what we're trying to solve for, how much equity we need in the pot, times the total pot when we get called, minus the amount we put into the pot in this situation. Notice that we're only putting in 24.5 big blinds instead of 25 because we're in the small blind. We already have half a big blind in the pot. So now we need to solve for equity in the pot. Here's our full equation, by the way. See, it's a bit of a mess. I'm not the best at math, so I just used an online algebra calculator. Google algebra calculator, it'll come right up. Then you would type this whole thing here. You would type this whole thing into the algebra calculator, click calculate, and it will tell you the equity you need in the pot to break even. Whenever you are entering something into the algebra calculator, this is going to need to be a variable, whatever variable your site uses, X, Y, Z, whatever. This is going to need to be X. This is going to need to be X. I know I have X here for multiplication to make it easier for those who are not really good at math, but this is how you go about doing this in an algebra calculator. Okay, so the equity you need in the pot to break even is 38.8%. And let's suppose we want to have 41% to ensure we have an edge. Okay? Now we can actually solve this whole equation. We can try to figure out what profit will be if we set our equity to 41%. So go through here, do the math again. If you solve this, that will result in us winning 0.89 big blinds, which may or may not be worth it depending on the field strength, where you are in the tournament, etc. But remember how I said earlier, winning one big blind per... If you can shove and win about one big blind, you're usually pretty happy in these spots. And I think that's fine. If we happen to have 43% equity, though, if we change this number to 43% and this number to 43%, now we're going to win 1.7 big blinds, which is huge. So in this situation, we essentially want to figure out which hands have roughly that much equity against our opponent's ranges. Well, now we can use Equalab to see which hands have roughly 42% equity in those common situations when you go all in and the 3-better calls. And it turns out that against our opponent's range, remember, this is the range our opponent's going to 3-bet and then call with, right? Aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace, king. It turns out against that range, only aces and kings can profitably shove. So in that scenario, when it goes raise, 3-bet, if our opponents are...
This is the argument for never folding kings preflop. I have seen people, and people have asked me, and people have messaged me, and people have said, oh, I was in this scenario, blah, 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 blah. And then they gave me the gotcha answer where they're like, all these things went wrong, and I got it in with kings, and I was up against aces, and that's the gotcha when I asked them what happened. And then I've thrown back at them, look, you can't know that they have aces. And if you're worried about one specific hand, it's whatever. So at 30 big blinds, you're probably just going to get in kings, and if you're up against aces, well, you're going to win 20% of the time, but 80% of the time you're going to go broke. It's just too fucking bad. There have been only like 2 or 3 times in my life in non-satellites I have folded kings preflop. I've been correct, but there have been many more times where I was almost making that same exact decision and one thing or another pushed me the other way, and because you have to really convince me to fold kings preflop. Aces I have folded preflop in a non-satellite situation exactly once in my life. And you say, why is that there? I'll tell that story if it needs to be heard. But it was a very specific situation, and it ended up being the right choice. But it was situational. Mathematically, it was incorrect. But situationally, it was correct.
Using good, fundamentally sound strategies, we can only 4-bet all in with aces and kings. Pretty nitty, huh? If we were fine with breaking even, we could add queens and ace-king suited.
So a situation where you'd be fine with breaking even would be like if you had 25 blinds and the blinds are going to go up, soon, and the next blind level is going to be a big jump. Like if it jumps from, if the blinds are, 2,500, 5K, and some tournaments it jumps to 5K, 10K. You know what I'm saying? And you're sitting there with 25 blinds. When the blinds go up, you're going to get cut in half. You're going to get cut to having 12 or 13 blinds, and you're screwed. If that's the next blind level, I'm putting back in the queens and ace-king suited because it's a break-even scenario, but if I happen to win this time, I'll be okay when the blinds go up, versus when the blinds go up, I am in ultra danger zone at this point in the tournament. So those are things to consider as to why you would take a break-even proposition and just hope, well, maybe this time I win. Because sometimes 50-50 is enough. And that's the factor that comes into play.
So as you see, this is not a particularly great spot. However, you should know by now how to tinker with that equation to figure out how profitable the shove would be if your opponents used different strategies. So if your opponents are playing well, or if they're tight, you know you in turn must be really tight. As we've already discussed previously, when there was a raise and a caller, if the initial raise was tight, you got to be tight. If the raise and the 3-better are tight, you got to be tight. But what happens if they are loose? What happens if they fold too often to your all-in? What if, essentially this player on the button just had more 3-bet bluffs, right? If they were 3-bet bluffing too often, this number would no longer be 58%. This number would be 40% or 30% or whatever it would be. Maybe this player doesn't call off against the jam with 10s, 9s, ace, queen, right? That would also raise the percentage of the time that our opponents fold. So this would go from 0.232 to maybe, 0.5 or something like that. How would that change the equation? Do the math, figure it out, right? What if your opponents call too wide? What if instead of 3-betting with this good polarized strategy, they 3-bet with a very linear strategy and they call your shove with pocket 8s and ace-jack suited? How does that change things?
You'll see that a lot too.
Ask yourself that, figure that out.
You'll see that a lot in scenarios where players 3-bet the pocket 8s, right? Which should be 3-betting as a bluff. So when they get shoved on, they fold. But then they get shoved on and, let's say it's 25 big blinds. Somebody raised, they made it 6, and they have 19 big blinds left, and you jam all in for the 25 big blinds effective, and it folds back to them, and they look at pocket 8s. You'd be amazed how many times people will sit there and go, well, if I had gotten shoved on by the guy who originally raised, then I was going to fold. But because this guy behind me, cold 4-bet shove, which should be stronger, they don't realize that. They're like, well, it cost me 19 to win 55 blinds. I can usually do that with pocket 8s because if it's a race, I'm good. That's true. If it's a race, you're good. But it's not going to be a race often enough. I'm going to jam pocket 10s plus there quite a bit versus the right players, and you're just going to roll over a 20% winner, you know what I'm saying, which is going to suck. And you're just going to sit there, getting eliminated from the tournament 80% of the time. So that's the situation where you'll see that happening quite a bit.
What about if your opponents are raising and 3-betting with only the super nuts? What can you get it all in with then? It may actually be only aces, which is kind of crazy to think about, but that is what happens some portion of the time. So this is the type of work you want to be doing on your end away from the table to figure out how ranges interact with each other and how you get to adjust your play to take advantage of whatever your opponents do incorrectly. There have been many spots in tournaments where I've just seen scenarios where the opponents were both really, really tight. I mean, I'm not trying to fold kings preflop, but I've done it a few times when it goes raise 3-bet from a super nitty player. Usually it was 2 early position players, and they were both super nits, and it's like, well, one of the 2 of them probably has aces. Obviously, they could both have ace-king, but notice I have 2 king blockers, right? And if you know they don't 3-bet stuff like queens, and you have 2 king blockers, well, now aces becomes somewhat likely, right? So you always want to try to figure out what your opponents are doing and then adjust accordingly. And do not be afraid to make big adjustments. That said, understand very often you could just be wrong. I think a lot of people think that their reads are always definitively spot on. And I can tell you, they're not. They're not always definitively going to be spot on. So you always want to make sure you know the good, fundamentally sound strategy. In this scenario, as I've just shown you here, it's going to be something like queens and ace-king or better to get in if your opponents are playing well. But you're going to find that a lot of people just don't play well. So you really should pay attention and try to adjust. And like I said, in scenarios like this, I'm probably getting in with something like jacks or better and ace-king. And you're going to find this kind of hard to go too wrong whenever you're against a raise and a call. I'm sorry, raising a 3-bet if you think their ranges are a little bit loose, a little bit splashy, and not polarized very well. You're going to find a lot of players just don't use a good, fundamentally sound, polarized 3-betting strategy. They usually 3-bet way more linearly, and sometimes way too much. And if they're 3-betting way too much, your fold equity is going to go up, and if your fold equity goes up even a little bit, you get to jam wider.
Yeah, I'm playing today. I won that satellite seat, the $22 ticket, so I'm looking at playing a flight today at 2:30. So I'm probably going to start playing today. Yeah, I might just start at 2:30. I might start a little earlier. I might start at like 1:30 or so to get in on these. But I think 2:30 is probably my start time because we got a ticket, man. And wouldn't it be great to win through a flight on a ticket, that we won for $1.40, to get through with 1,000,000 chips, which is the goal, playing these flights to play in the big one tomorrow. Playing for like 35 or 40K first. So that I think is what I'm going to do today. It's a fun thing to do. There's also these tournaments at 2:30 that start, and these are good ones that I like. There's also this one going off at 3:30. That's a little bit big, but I'll spin for it. So there's a lot of good stuff. There's the 3K that we did well in the other day. So yeah, 2:30 is going to be my start time for today's play. What was I going to say? I was going to say something about this, but I think Jonathan Little said it best. So let's go ahead and do the quiz. Everyone folds to a normal player in the cutoff, raises 2 big blinds out of 25 big blind effective. Button 3 bets to 5 big blinds. You're in the small blind. Should you have a calling range? No. There is no calling range in the small blind. Just in general, if you adopt that theory that you have no calling range in the small blind, you can only raise or fold, you will do much better overall. You will find you'll have a much greater success rate if you're like, well, I have to either raise or fold in the small blind. Then you look at your hand and you're like, can't raise that one, and you just fold it, or and you'll see that there'll be some times where you'll be like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, and you'll be like, But if it's not a situation you can jam it in, you really just want to fold it. So you should have no calling range in the small blind here. Linear jamming range, that's the term we're looking for. Normal player, cutoff, 25 big blinds raises. Button 3 bets to 5 big blinds in the small blind. You have 8-8. What should you do? Well, this is what I was just talking about. Versus a normal player's range, I feel like this is a good one to jam. But the 3-better here also knows the normal better's range, so because it's been raised and 3-bet, I think you can just fold here. I could be playing too tight, but I think versus the fields I'm in, it's a fold. That's what I'm going to answer here. Nope, 8-8 is good enough for late position raisers. It's true they're in late position, but you're talking about a normal player and the other player is known. I'd have to see it in game. I'm not saying it's 100% a fold, but I'm saying without information on the button, it's a fold. Because until it's shown otherwise, when players 3-bet in small stakes games, they have good hands, and I'm going to be dominated way too much. If 25 big blinds is a stack I'm looking to race, then yeah. Obviously with 20 blinds, I'm just getting it in more often. With 35, I'm getting it in less often in this blind level. But I think it's close, and I think it kind of depends on what I know about the button. Wasn't given any information here, so my standard answer is going to be to fold. But you can see 46% of the time it's a fold, 2% of the time it's a call, which is very rarely, and then 52% of the time it's an all-in. So it is close. Yeah, so I wouldn't count this as wrong. I would count this as, it depends. But yeah, you have to take these quizzes based on the levels you play. So I'm going to look at it. I'm going to reevaluate it. I'm going to play with Equilab. It's on my list. But at the same time, I said 7-7 because I've been running that one in Equilab in this scenario. But I guess 8-8 will just go up to that and see how it goes. But at the same time, I have to kind of realize that it is close. So let's see. Normal player, under the gun +1, who raises 2 big blinds. Under the gun +2, 3 bets to 5 big blinds. You're in the big blind with 9-9. That's a fold. These are 2 early position raisers with no extra information. This is a fold all day long. You can't even play the fucking hand because they're coming in an early position. And when you don't know something about a player, you can assume early position means a stronger hand. So there we go. We're going to do that. We're going to mark this as complete. We're going to go on to the last section and try to finish up this part of the blinds, 22 to 35 big blinds. Get that done.
Now let's discuss when you're facing a preflop 4-bet.
This ought to be quick.
If you are facing a preflop raise, a 3-bet, and then a cold 4-bet before the action gets to you, you need to fold basically everything. You should pretty much only be getting it all in with exactly aces and kings at that point because someone's going to have something really good. But that scenario is not going to come up too often. Most likely what's going to happen is someone's going to raise, you're going to 3-bet, and then the initial raiser is going to 4-bet you. You'll find that usually that 4-bet's going to be all in. If you're playing more like 35 big blinds deep, maybe they'll 4-bet to 13 big blinds some portion of the time. If that's the case, go back to the video where we discussed this situation a little bit more deeper stacked when you had like 45-ish big blinds or 50 big blinds. And then reference that video because that's going to be applying then. But if they are 4-betting all in, well, we really just have a math problem, right? We're in that same scenario. So when you do get 3-bet, or when you do 3-bet and get jammed on, unless you're playing a maniacal style where you're 3-betting all the time, you should typically assume that the 4-better has a pretty strong range. This is definitely going to be the case against recreational players, casual players, who are just sitting there trying to play good cards and get their money in good. These players are going to usually show up with something like...
Strong distinction. You're trying to play poker. They're playing cards. Meaning they're letting the cards decide what they do. It's not what I'm trying to do.
Pocket 8s are better, ace-jack suited are better, and ace-queen are better most of the time. But a lot of these players aren't just going to fold out stuff like pocket 9s or ace-queen because they realize these hands are good enough once they get this shallow. So your decision really is a pure math problem. Figure out your pot odds, add a little bit on top to the equity you need to win, and then figure out if your hand has the required equity against your opponent's range. If you are using a polarized strategy, as we've already discussed when we discussed which hands you should be 3-betting earlier, if you are using that polarized strategy, your decision is going to be very easy because you essentially just call at the top of your 3-betting range because you're 3-betting all the best hands and then some very obvious blocker bluffs. The blocker bluffs you fold, the nut hands you have an easy call. Life's easy. Turns out when you play good, fundamentally sound strategies, life is way easier than when you don't. Let's take a look at a common spot that comes up. Let's say the low jack raises to 2 big blinds out of his 25 big blind stack. We 3-bet with ace queen suited to 5.5 big blinds from the button, and then the low jack goes all in. So, in this situation, you want to ask, what are our pot odds? Well, we have to call 19.5 big blinds more. That's our 25 starting stack minus 5.5 to win a total of 52.5. That is our 25, our opponent's 25, the small blind, the big blind, and the ante. We do the math, that gives us 37%. And if we want to have a bit of an edge, maybe we call in the scenario with 39-ish% equity. So let's see what hands have 39% equity against various ranges. Let's see where ace-queen falls. So let's say we have ace-queen suited. And let's give our opponent just a pretty strong, tight range, right? Against this strong, tight range, you see ace-queen suited has 43% equity. It's pretty good. Can't fold even against a pretty strong range. Let's make our opponent a little bit tighter. Now it has 35% equity. So somewhere in this area is where ace-queen becomes a fold. If our opponent's jamming with this, you see ace-queen has that 41% equity. So essentially, if our opponent's jamming tighter than this is where we can consider folding. So we need them to only be jamming something like pocket 10s are better, ace-queen suited are better, and ace-king, right? So right here is where it flip-flops. So if our opponent's jamming this tight, we should fold. Otherwise, we should call. In general, I think you're going to find that most players shove wider than this, especially if you are decently active and you're playing some hands.
Meaning
right?
if you
are known to be very, very tight, then perhaps you could justify folding because if your opponent thinks that you are tight, they in turn will be tight. But most players are going to use wider ranges than this. Back in the day, a really strong play was to just 4-bet all in really, really wide. Again, you can actually use the exact same exploitative 3-betting strategy where we were discussing the fold equity, right? You can use that equation here to figure out which hands you can jam on against the 3-better. In that scenario, there would just be one opponent in the pot, right? Because you raise, they 3-bet, you jam, and then they're going to call some portion of the time and fold some portion of the time. A very strong play back in the day was to just 4-bet all in a ton because people were 3-betting a lot. If they're 3-betting too much, you get to 4-bet really wide. But if your opponents think you're going to be 3-betting very tight, they should be 4-betting very tight, right? So definitely take your opponent's range into consideration, but this all-in range here is really, really tight. So if your opponent is really, really tight, yeah, you can fold ace-queen suited, but that's very, very rarely going to be the case. Interestingly enough, if you do think your opponent's opening range is very, very tight, you should probably not 3-bet ace-queen suited in the first place, and you should just call with it. So you see that you should actually never be in that scenario where you're 3-betting against a tight player with ace-queen suited with the idea that you're going to fold it to a shove. You'd much rather just flat call pre-flop and see the flop. So in this scenario, you're going to find that you have a pretty easy call with ace queen suited, but this is a spot where a lot of recreational players fold. They 3-bet because they think they have the best hand, then they get 4-bet, and they're like, oh, now I don't, so I guess I fold. And if you're just consistently putting in 5.5 big blinds out of your 25 big blind stack on a regular basis, and then folding, you're just going to get crushed, especially if they're jamming on you decently often. So always keep minimum defense frequency in mind. Minimum defense frequency still applies again. Remember, 1 minus the bet divided by the bet plus the pot. That said, if your opponent is very tight when it comes to jamming, it definitely does not apply. If your opponent is very loose when it comes to jamming, make sure you defend way more than the minimum defense frequency. If you fold too often, your opponents can crush you by jamming wide. And alternatively, if your opponents fold too often, you can crush them by jamming wide, as we've already discussed when we discussed exploitatively jamming all in. Another strong play here is to 3-bet small with a wide range against players who only 4-bet all in with the absolute best hands. That will work out very, very well, especially with hands like blockers, because you're going to find a lot of players will open pretty wide, especially from the button cutoff small or button cutoff and hijack seats, but they'll fold to a reasonable 3-bet because they just assume you must have a good hand, and they're not willing to risk their tournament life without a really good hand as well. So they're going to raise with a normal range, but then only 4-bet with the nuts. So 3-betting with blockers there, like ace-x, hands like ace-jack, ace-10, ace-9, those are very, very good hands to 3-bet bluff with. In this scenario, small, with the idea that you can fold to those very tight players. That is a very strong strategy. Realize, though, once stacks do get short, some tighter players will only min-raise pre-flop with hands that they plan on getting all in. And when I say min-raise, I essentially mean make a normal raise size, whatever that is. Some players will only raise pre-flop with hands they plan on getting all in, meaning you may have very little to no fold equity.
Right.
And you know from the fold equity equation, if you have no fold equity, you just need a very, very powerful hand in order to get it all in, because you're just taking your hand and running its equity against your opponent's strong range. So please, please, please pay attention and adjust accordingly. I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of people think shallow stack poker is just all bingo. You run your hand into your opponent's hand and you see who wins. But there's a whole lot of nuance when it comes to picking up these small pots that some people never pick up, or finding spots to 4-bet jam over your opponent, or finding spots to 3-bet with a wide range as a bluff and then exploitatively fold because your opponents are only jamming the nuts. There's a lot of skill involved when you're playing shallow stacked, and the neat thing about playing shallow stacked is that even winning a big blind or two more than your opponents do on average can amount to a huge amount of money. Usually because when we're playing with the shallower stacks, we're playing deeper in the tournament. And as you get deeper and deeper in the tournament, a big blind may be a whole starting stack, right?
Yep.
So if you can win an extra starting stack, whatever a buy-in is, every few orbits that your opponents don't win because they don't make the same good plays you do, that adds up to a ton of money long-term. And this is where a lot of the profit is made in tournaments. So make sure you understand these spots well. Make sure you study them well. And most importantly, make sure you pay attention to what your opponents are doing and then maximally adjust to take advantage of them.
Again, this is why the 22 to 35 big blind range section is my favorite, because this is where you live in the tournament most of the time. You mostly live here. And hopefully you live here and then you jump up and go back up to the 50 big blind range, but then your blinds go up and you're going to be back in the 35 to 22. So this is your meat and potatoes of the tournament, this blind level. So the last 4 episodes have been all about it. This will be the 5th one. You can go back and find in my YouTube, you can go back and find this thumbnail, this general look of me here versus the deck. This is the 22 to 35 big blind thumbnail. This is yesterday's thumbnail. You'll see parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the book. Go through these many times. This is the meat and potatoes of tournament poker. This is where you make or break your stands. All right, let's do the quiz. Finish this up. Everyone folds to a normal player in the cutoff who raises 2 big blinds out of 25 big blinds effective. You 3-bet 5.5 ace-9 off from the button. The cutoff goes all in. You should. This is one of those ones where it's a fold. Your hand's just not strong enough. Sucks to give it up, but you kind of have to. Yeah. Too weak to call the 4-bet. Easy enough, right? Loose aggressive player in the low jack. 2 big blinds out of his 25 big blinds effective. You 3-bet. Same scenario with 10-10. Low jack goes all in. Snap call. This is a loose player. He's opening and jamming with hands as weak as pocket 8s and 7s. Also hands with blockers like King Jack, King Queen, King 10, Queen 10, all those hands. So this is an absolute call all day long. Very profitable. Loose aggressive player in the low jack, 2 big blinds. You 3-bet to 6.5 with ace jack suited. The low jack goes all in. This is a little closer, but I still think it merits a call. He's a loose aggressive player. He's not going to be folding very much. So I'm going to go ahead and go with the call here. Yeah, still very profitable call. Ace jack suited, and it's important to delineate the non-paired cards from the paired cards. I would call 10-10 and ace jack suited usually not as close in value pre-flop, but in this scenario they're pretty much the same. So yeah, we're going to mark this as complete, and we're going to go back to the courses. We're going to make sure that everything's been checked off. Yep, 100% complete. 22 to 35 big blinds was a great section. Like I said, it is my most favorite part of this tournament masterclass, because I find it to be the most useful. This exploitative pre-flop jamming range that we did 2 days ago, where we started that. From here down, if you just master this part, you're going to immediately see yourself not only going further in tournaments, but winning more, because you're going to end up in situations where you have more chips longer, and then you're going to end up, doubling up and having a pile. This is exactly how you do it. So very interesting stuff. I'm going to go ahead and mark this as complete. And we're going to go back to the courses. There we go. So the next course is pre-flop, 12 to 22 big blinds. And there is a lot of play left. There's even a section lower than this, 12 big blinds and less, 8 big blinds. So there's still a lot of play left in this scenario. And I really love this course because it broke down every little blind level that you get in tournaments significantly. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and play today. I'm going to come back at 2:30, probably close to 2:30 on the dot, because I want to play this right here, this flight, to get into the 100K guaranteed for tomorrow. So we're going to play that. I might come back a little bit earlier. I don't see too much I want to play. Maybe this 440 that starts before it, that starts at 1:30. But no, I think everything's pretty much after. So we're going to concentrate on the flight and smaller buy-in tournaments and some Zoom today. So it's going to be a long day, lots of play. And yeah, it's going to be fun. So I'll, let me see. I don't think there's anybody really to host right now. Everybody's kind of getting their day going. So I'm not going to host anybody. I'm just going to let it go. I'll see you guys at 2:30 Pacific Standard Time. That's Vegas time. It is now 11:45 here. So that's about 2 hours, 45 minutes. I'll be back. And I'll see you guys later. Have fun till I see you.